service or a project. It is essential to identify the benefits and limitations of the bioeconomy and the biotechnologies. But one element that is important to highlight here with the biotechnologies is that most of them, specifically in the case of the synthetic biology applications, is that they are emerging technologies. And that means that these technologies are under development, they are under deployment. And this is, on one hand, this is positive because it gives you an opportunity to introduce environmental improvements when it is easier and cheaper. But on the other hand, it is also very challenging because it implies to modeling the future. And associated to modeling the future, there are some limitations. There are, for example, lack of data, because you use data and probably you are dealing with data that is not ready yet. There are also issues with the upscaling, because most of these technologies are developing on their lab scale or maybe pilot plant scale. And because the idea of the LCA is to project this into a commercial or large facility, you need to upscale data that you are using to represent a bigger facility. And associated to everything it is high uncertainty associated to this. And to deal with these limitations or gaps, there are two tendencies that we can say in the LCA community. So most of LCA dealing with emerging technologies are applying what we can call prospective studies. And the idea of this is to model the future. So they use different technologies to upscale data that they have. And they use, for example, learner cubes or extreme scenarios. So the idea is to model the future to understand how this technology might look or might evolve in the next 5-10 years, and to model in accordance to that. But there's also a new tendency, which is it has been applied in less studies, what is called anticipatory studies. And the idea of these studies is to include into the evaluation, into the environmental evaluation, also social and ethical concerns and values into that. So the idea is, instead of focusing into modeling the future, is more in line with being ready for the future. And based on these two different type of projects or type of studies, this is why we have developed this integration of LCA with stakeholder engagement. So two main goals: to understand how an emerging technology needs to evolve to guarantee sustainable supply chains in line with modeling the future, but also to understand how society or industry, in general stakeholders, will perceive and integrate new products, specifically when they are based on genetically modified organisms, how they are going to integrate and perceive them into their labs. And this is more in line with be ready for the future, how we can avoid any unintended consequences associated to our project or our product that are under development. And we have applied this approach to the case study of BESTER project. BESTER project ended last June, so just 15 days ago, and it was a 3-year project funded by the European Commission under the program ERA-CoBiotech, and also in the case of the Imperial College London, funded by the BBSRC, which is the UK government department of the development of biotechnologies. And BESTER project aimed to produce butyl esters, which is a specific type of chemicals that are used in the production of fragrances and paintings mostly, but they can use in different other processes. And the idea was to develop new butyl esters from renewable resources, in this case from forestry resources, and also by using bacteria that were genetically modified, using synthetic biology and systems biology, and to use these forestry resources and these GMOs to produce these butyl esters. Nowadays, these butyl esters are produced from fossil base. So the idea was to evaluate if these new value chains was environmentally and also economically better and also feasible from a technology point of view in comparison with the production of the current butyl esters. In this project, we have partners from Norway, we have SINTEF, also from Germany, we have the University of Ulm and the University of Rostock. From United Kingdom, we have BioCliff that previously was RIM Biologics, and also we had Imperial College. Finally, from France, we have Processium helping us with the development of this butyl esters production. So we decided, okay, let's integrate stakeholder engagement within the LCA. But before that, we conduct some preliminary LCA based on the data facilitated by our partners. And this data was mainly from experimental activities conducted at a lab scale. So we were dealing with TRL technology readiness level around 3 and 4. And the idea was to, at the end of the project, to be around TRL 5. And we present this preliminary LCA to the stakeholders with the idea to have some feedback on the LCA calculation and also on how we need to improve or conduct the LCA to represent their views also into the environmental quantifications. Now I'm going to explain you how we did this stakeholder engagement. So at the beginning, we planned to conduct a physical workshop, but it was planned to be conducted in May last year. For obvious reasons, we needed to cancel it. We adapt our goals and expectations, and we decided to do online interviews. The positive thing about that is that it has turned to be more effective than having a workshop, because we have had a final workshop last month. And this type of engagement is more effective with online with interviews. It doesn't mean to be online, but in this case, we needed to do it online. And so we conducted some interviews, and we divided the interviews into 3 different parts. In the first part, we use the interviews to validate some of the data that we have from the experimental activities, but also some data that we needed to complement with the literature review. And also we use it to validate some of the assumptions that we have considered in the upscaling process. And also we use the interviews to evaluate and to set some alternative scenarios to our baseline scenario. In the second part, we use the stakeholder inputs and in the process to design the LCA. So we were discussing about what system boundaries we need to include into this study, why, what not, what type of allocation different stakeholders believe is more interesting or more representative, more credible for them, and why. What type of impact categories, so what is more important for them and why, what is necessary to include, what not. And finally, to what extent is important to include weighting and normalization into this LCA. And the third and final part of the interviews were focused in understanding social, ethical, and legal aspects associated to the use of GMOs and synthetic biology. So we were discussing about what they believe it is important, if they have some concerns about the use of GMOs, why not, to understand why or what is important for them about biosafety, what they think the public is going to believe about these projects, if they are going to have some concerns, or if they are going to accept them and they are going to have no concerns about using this, for example, these fragrances or not. And also if they think we need to consider other elements into the LCA, but also on combination with the LCA. So the idea is to understand, okay, this is the data that we have used. Do they think this is representative for the project? Because LCA practitioners, we have a lot of experience and knowledge about the LCA, but we might not have all knowledge that is necessary to represent a technology that is under development. And also we use these interviews to understand what is decidable and also what is not decidable from a technology point of view from different stakeholders. And we divided the stakeholders into 4 different groups. We have policymakers, we have business and industry, we have researchers, and we have a group for NGOs and civil social organizations. And for each group, we divided it into different categories. For example, you will see here that under the group of policymakers, we have policy advisors, regulatory bodies, or policy analysts. And for each category of stakeholders, we identified representatives that may be interested or willing to participate into these online interviews. As a summary, you will see in green is representatives that we were able to engage with, and in red, representatives or category of stakeholders that it was very difficult or impossible to engage with. And as an interesting fact, you will see that researchers are more willing to participate and help other researchers into the process. So we conducted interviews in between July and August last year, and also between September and December last year. And we ended interviewing policymakers. We conducted 4 interviews for policymakers, 3 interviews for representatives from business and industry, 4 interviews for NGOs and civil social organizations, and also interviews 3 researchers from different groups. And here I would like to explain you the main outputs that we get from these interviews. So in relation to validating the data and assumptions, we were discussing with them how we have upscaling the data, how we have moved from data that it was obtained at a lab scale to represent a commercial or a large facility. And for that, we use Aspen and extreme scenarios. And the stakeholders that has more technical background were helpful because they understand what we're trying to do, and they were they see that the use of Aspen and how we have upscaling the process was credible and representative. But we needed to update some of the data that we were using because it was a little bit old. In the case of, this is very important, in the case of the energy supply, we were assuming the use of a CHP plan. But one of the stakeholders that we interviewed was an expert on that, and he advised us that for the process that we are evaluating, the use of a CHP plan was going to increase the complexity of the system, and it wasn't necessary because the energy supply could be, the energy demand can be supplied with a biomass boiler, and also the use of a CHP plan is going to increase the economic cost and also then the economic cost of the beauty esters. We also discussed the use of, during the process, we use solvent and butanol, and originally we were planning to use solvent and butanol from fossil fuels. And we were interested to understand how or at what extent we needed to tell our partners that they need to evaluate or test the possibility to incorporate bio-based options, both for the solvent and the butanol. Even there are some trade-offs associated to that. The main trade-off is that fossil solvent and butanol are less expensive. And in the case of biosolvents and biobutanol, the economic cost associated to that increases. And these are the summary of this part. So policy advisors and policy analysts believed that we needed to use bio-based options, regardless the economic price, because this is more in line with policy priorities and this is in line with the goals of the European Green Deal. In the case of representatives from the business and industry and also from researchers, they believe like in the medium term, we can use fossil-based options just to maintain or to have products that are competitive in the market. And also because this is more feasible from a technical point of view. It was agreed for all of them that the location of the facility is going to be key. So this is very important to understand and to set where this large facility might be located in the future. And now looking into how the LCA could be designed with them, with the stakeholder engagement, to the question to what system boundary should be included into the study. At the beginning, we were focused into the manufacturing only, but based on the interviews, we understood that we needed to expand the system boundaries to also include the production of the feedstock. So we limited the study to a cradle to gate. And it was very important to, I would say, most of the stakeholders, how the use of forestry resources is going to affect the carbon accounting. it was important to evaluate different forest management to understand if the forestry resources are coming from sustainable forests or not. It was also important to evaluate different logistics associated to these forestry resources, how far are from the manufacturing site. And also it was important specifically for representatives from NGOs, how the use of these forestry resources is going to affect other users of these forestry resources. So this means how us, by using these forestry resources, are going to affect others that are using these to produce, I don't know, timber or to produce heat. So how are we going to affect them? Or how are we going to displace these uses, and what are going to be the indirect consequences associated to that? This is very complex, but they believe that in further stages of the project, we need to understand and to look into these indirect consequences. To the question of multifunctionality, as expected, there was no agreement. So depending on the stakeholder, depending on their own beliefs and on if they have or not LCA background, they believe that the multifunctionality should be dealt in different ways. Basically, as there were no agreement, we decided to conduct to apply different allocation approaches based on sensitivity analysis, and explain the assumptions should be very, very clear to when we communicate the LCA results. To the question of what impact categories do we need to include into the study, all stakeholders believe that the most important that should be included, regardless the output, is climate change, water consumption or water scarcity, biodiversity impacts, and land use impacts. Even these projects or these products are using GMOs. Toxicity was also important for some of the stakeholders, but because the beauty esters from fossil fuels and our beauty esters are the same, they believe that because the system boundary should be limited to cradle to gate, the toxicity impacts are going to be equally to the impacts of the fossil beauty esters. So this was what this toxicity analysis should be considered in use phase or the end of life of the process. And one thing that was that we were told by different policy advisors and analysts is instead of using recipe as the methodology for calculating the environmental impacts, that we needed to use the product environmental footprint because it has more broad agreement and more scientific agreement at a European level. And because we are evaluating products produced in Europe, this was going to be more representative. And finally, to the question of to what extent the weighting and normalization should be included, there was no agreement, but they advised us to include this into further studies to understand that this is linked to the location. And the final part of the interviews were focusing, as I told you, in understanding different social, ethical, and legal aspects of the development of these beauty esters. And we were surprised because we were expected that majority of stakeholders were going to have some concerns about the use of GMOs or the use of synthetic biology. But we were surprised because they have no concerns about us producing these bacteria and modify them and creating these bacteria, because they believe this is not going to affect them because these products, these beauty esters, are not for food consumption. But we saw some differences on this answer depending on where the stakeholder was located. For example, the stakeholders that we interviewed that were based in Norway, they have more concern about the use of GMOs, but not for how it's going to affect them, the health, the human health. They were more concerned about how this is going to affect the environment. What happens if there is an environmental release of these bacteria? How are they going to interact with other microorganisms, and what are the consequences of having this? And we have an interview with a scientific communicator, and he told us that it is really important how we communicate these results, and everything that we communicate should be based on scientific evidences that could be based on literature review, on lab tests. So if we are going to say that these GMOs are not going to affect the environment if there is an accidental release, we should conduct some lab tests, or we should communicate this based on scientific literature review. And at some point, it was highlighted by researchers and business and industry that we needed to conduct risk analysis to evaluate also other risks associated to this facility. So how it is going to affect the use of solvents, etc. So to have a bigger or broader risk assessment analysis. And in relation to the public acceptance, they believe that the public in general is not going to have any problem or any concern associated to the development and use of this product, but we needed to be very transparent and communicate and not convince, because it might happen that for some people, this is going to be a key element or a problematic product, and we are going to have, it might happen that we have some controversies around this. And in general, they believe like there is a lack of environmental understanding on the use of forestry resources. This was perceived very important by representatives of business and industry. And that's why they think that we need to conduct additional quantifications associated to the use of these forestry resources to show and to prove that we are not going to generate any other indirect consequence to others. And all of them believe that we should include, in combination with environmental studies, also include some social aspects. For example, by using social LCA or by having a sustainable LCA of the project. So we are in the intermediate part of the process. So we started with a preliminary LCA only based on inputs of the experimental activities and literature review. After we conducted these interviews with the stakeholders, we have some feedback that we included into a new calculation of the LCA. And under the annual meeting that we have with the partners, we present the results of the intermediate LCA, and we were discussed and agreed on conduct additional experimental activities, basically to evaluate three different things. One, to evaluate the possibility to use biobutanol as a solvent, instead of having a fossil-based solvent, to use a biobutanol, which the biobutanol was produced by one of our partners. So the idea is to test how the process is going to look like if we use a biobutanol instead of a solvent. The second thing that partners conducted at lab scale was the recycling of the enzyme, because originally the enzyme was recycling 8 times, and they wanted to test what happens if they recycle enzyme instead of 8 times, 15 times. And finally, what happens if they use, instead of a fossil-based enzyme, a bio-based enzyme, catalyst, sorry. So after a few months, partners finished the experimental activities, and these were the outputs. When they used biobutanol as solvent, the theoretical or the environmental preliminary results saw an important reduction into the environmental impacts, but it was very complicated. So it complicated the process so much that in the end, it was going to increase the environmental impacts, because the energy consumption associated to the use of the biobutanol was going to increase, and also the economic cost associated to that. Based on that, we decided to forget about this option and to move on and to use the fossil-based, the original fossil-based solvent. In the case of the recycling rate, it was test positive, and the enzyme could be recycled at up to 15 times. And it was impossible to test a new bio-based catalyst because it wasn't ready on the market, and also because it looks very complicated to introduce into the process. So after all, part of the inputs from the stakeholders were evaluated under experimental activities, and only one of the options was considered to continue to include into the process. So here is the roadmap of how we have co-designed the LCA with the stakeholder engagement. So we started with a preliminary LCA. We have some stakeholder inputs. We present this to partners. We decided to test new experimental activities. The results or the outputs of these experimental activities have been finally included into the LCA. And now I'm going to explain you the results of the final LCA based on the stakeholder inputs and also on the final inputs from the partners. So this is our baseline scenario where we have included the feedstock production and also the bester process. And as an outputs, we have the butyl esters here and also the valley process. So from the forestry resources, we have this valley process, which is the raw material for the bester process. And from this process, we have two other co-products going out from the system boundaries. So we have the production of bioethanol and the production of lignosulfonate. And these are some general assumptions associated to the baseline scenario. So as we assume, because we didn't know by then where this large facility is going to be located, but we decided to locate it in Norway because this is where actually the production of the valley, which is the raw material that we needed into our process, is produced right now. So we decided to assume, okay, let's assume that this plant is going to be located near the facilities. And we were assumed that we are going to produce 20,000 tons per year of these butyl esters. The forestry feedstock to produce the valley was coming from spruce and from sustainable forests, because this is what is happening right now in Norway. Also, the solvent that we consider in the process is heptane from fossil fuels. And same with the butanol, they are coming also from fossil fuels. The enzyme could be recycled up to 10 times. The information for the inventory, the data for the production of the enzyme was coming from EcoInvent. And in this case, the enzyme that was available was Novozyme 188. Even this is not the enzyme that we are using into the bester process. And as default, we decided to use system expansion as the allocation approach. And this is the general results, only focus on climate change, land use, and water scarcity based on the product environmental footprint methodology. Here you will see the table where we have included the production of the spruce, the valley production or the valley process, the bester process, and finally the results of the full butyl esters production. And in these figures, you will see the Sankey diagram of producing these butyl esters, only limited for climate change. And what you can see is that the production of the valley, because there are some other products going out of the system, represents or reduces the environmental impacts of the final butyl esters production. And now, if we look specifically into the environmental impacts of the bester process, only into the bester process, we see here that the butanol is the main contributor on the climate change emissions. It's followed by the salts and nutrients production, the enzymes, and finally the solvent. If we look into the land use, we'll see that the most 86% of the impacts are coming from the production or the use of the salts and nutrients. And in the case of the water scarcity, 69% of the impacts are coming from the use of the enzymes. In the case of the climate change, the majority of the impacts are coming from the use of the butanol, because this butanol is coming from fossil fuels, and that's why this high amount of CO2 emissions. In the case of the land use, the production of the salts and nutrients, and the salts and nutrients are necessary to feed the bacteria that are necessary in the process. And this high amount of impacts are coming by the use of glucose, because this glucose was necessary to feed these bacteria, and the production of this glucose generates a huge amount of land use impacts. So if we wanted to decrease the environmental impacts of our process for the land use impact category, we need to think about how, and if it's feasible, to substitute this glucose production. And in the case of the water scarcity, we see here that the enzymes are generating the majority of the water impacts. But because we use information from EcoInvent, and this information was aggregated, we are not able to understand the origin or the hotspot of this water scarcity. And here you will see the valley production, where you can see also on the table with negative values, but also in the figure in green, that this process is subtracting, in theory, CO2 emissions from the atmosphere due to the production of these co-products, and also with the same with the land use and the water scarcity. And we have also evaluated our baseline scenario, but also 2 alternative scenarios. In the first alternative scenario, we included into the system boundaries the production of the biobutanol. So instead, the idea was to substitute the butanol that was used into the Bester process with biobutanol. And the production of the butanol, as I told you before, is produced by one of our partners in the US. So the idea was to evaluate, okay, what is going to happen, how the environmental impacts are going to look like if we integrate the Valley process with the Bester process and this AB process. And this AB process produces biobutanol also from spruce and also using the Valley process. So that it was very feasible and very feasible to integrate these products, these 2 different processes, into our system boundaries. And you will see here that we have as outputs from the system boundaries the bioethanol and the lignosulfonate from the Valley process, but we also have other sources of bioethanol and acetone from the AB process. And let's look how the environmental results look like. Again, just limited to climate change, land use, and water scarcity, we'll see that the butyl esters production has negative emissions in the case of climate change and land use impacts, and the reduction of the water scarcity is quite high. And this is because, again, the Valley production and the AB process has co-products going out of the system, and that and because we have used system expansion approach as default, we have this decrease or these negative emissions associated to that. Here is just to illustrate how the AB process produces ethanol and acetone and how this affects the final results. And the final alternative scenario that we had was very similar to the baseline scenario, but instead of using butanol from fossil fuels, we decided to use biobutanol, but the AB process was outside the system boundaries. And these are the results. So we have the same environmental impacts for the feedstock production from the spruce, the same environmental impacts for the Valley production, but in the case of the Bester process, because we use biobutanol instead of butanol, we decreases the environmental impacts a little bit. And now if we compare the different scenarios, and also we compare them with the production of the butyl esters from fossil fuels, we can see that if we focus into climate change, all the scenarios represent a reduction in the CO2 emissions in comparison with the fossil-based butyl esters. But if we look into the land use, we see that the baseline scenario and the alternative scenario 2 represent an important increase in the land use impact. And as I have explained it to you, this is because of the use of the glucose. So in further stages of the project, we will need to evaluate if this is possible and if it's possible to decrease or substitute the consumption of glucose in order to decrease the impacts associated to the land use. And in the case of the water scarcity, both the alternative 1 and the alternative 2 represents a reduction in the impacts of the water's consumption in relation to the base butyl esters. But in the case of the baseline scenario, we still represents the Bester process represents an increase of the water consumption. We also conducted some sensitivity assessment based on key parameters that we identified where we were developing the LCA, but also because some of these parameters were highlighted by the different stakeholders. And we evaluate 8 scenarios under the sensitivity assessment. We consider the reduction of the feedstock distance, because as default we have that the forestry were 300 kilometers away from the manufacturing site, and we evaluated the reduction of this distance by 150 kilometers and 75 kilometers. We also evaluate how the environmental impacts are going to be in the case of locating this facility instead of being in Norway, in Germany, or in the UK. as the allocation approach, we use system expansion as default, but we evaluated the possibility to use mass allocation and economic allocation. And finally, we decided to evaluate how the recycling rate, how the increase in the recycling rate or decrease in it is going to affect the final results of the production of these beauty esters. And this is the results only for climate change, because we didn't have time today to look into other impact categories. And here in red, we have the baseline scenario. Here in gray, we have the fossil butyl esters. And if we look into how the environmental impacts, in this case, climate change, CO2 emissions are going to decrease if we reduce the distance from the forestry, from the forest to the manufacturing site, we reduce slightly the environmental impacts associated to that. When we look into how the location of this manufacturing site is going to affect the final results, we'll see that in the case of locating this manufacturing, this large facility in the UK or in Germany, we are going to increase the climate change impact in relation to the baseline scenario. And in the case of the UK, we are also even to increase the CO2 emissions in comparison with the fossil butyl esters. In the case of recycling rate, it's not very important parameter, because if we increase the recycling rate up to 15 times, we decrease slightly the climate change impact. And if we reduce it up to 8 times, we increase slightly. So this is not the most important parameter. And what we can see here in this figure is that the most important parameter is the economic or the mass allocation used for how to deal with the co-products. With the baseline scenario, we use a system expansion approach. So we obtain smaller climate change impact in comparison with the fossil butyl esters. But when we change to an economic or a mass allocation, we increase the environmental impacts. And we were expect to have these results. And in case of communicating the results, the LCA results of this new value change, we need to represent and to present the results of all these allocation approaches. And based on the inputs of the different stakeholders in next stages of the BEST project. So the project has ended, but we expect it to start a new process soon. And this is the list of activities that we needed to include. All the stakeholders believe that the biodiversity impacts should be included into the LCA or should be included into the quantification of the environmental impacts. But because we didn't know the location, it was very difficult to quantify the effect, how we are going to affect the biodiversity in the forestry surrounding. And once we have the location, it would be easier to calculate the biodiversity impacts. And also because in the life cycle assessment, the impact categories for the biodiversity are currently under development, we thought that we will evaluate the biodiversity impacts in using an additional methodology in combination with the LCA. In further stages, we are also going to evaluate the risk assessment and the risk analysis to evaluate the potential risk of the use of GMOs and having accidental releases. Once we have the location, we are going also to evaluate the normalization and the weighting steps, probably as additional or complementary information. And it is going to be very important, and it's going to take most of our consumption and resources to evaluate the impacts of using the forestry resources. Even the forestry resources is out of the scope of the BEST project, and we can control how the forestry resources are going to affect other uses. But we need to evaluate the indirect land use changes, the carbon storage, how it's going to affect the carbon storage of the forestry as a whole, etc. And probably we are going to expand the forestry resources or the forestry quantification to also include socioeconomic impacts associated to that. So finally, I'm going to finish soon. So the main conclusions of this approach is that the stakeholder engagement has benefited the LCA because it has helped us to understand and to improve the data that we have used. It has helped us to define alternative scenarios that are more representative, and we believe that our LCA results are more credible because we have included different views into that. We are fully aware that we haven't included most of the recommendations from the stakeholders. For example, we haven't included the biodiversity impacts or the quantification of the indirect land use change impacts, mostly because we didn't have the time and the resources to do that. But in next stages of the project, we will focus in that. So if this production is moving to a deployment stage, we will have this analysis, so we will have more information of what are the environmental implications of this new value chain. In relation to the stakeholder identification, to have a good representation is key to incorporate the different voices and the different elements into the evaluation. And to conduct online interviews is an expensive process. You can engage with many different people. We had some concerns, some issues with engaging with some representatives, but in principle, people is willing to participate, specifically because they don't need to travel, and it only implies for them an hour and a half, more or less. And in relation, the main conclusions of the butyl esters value chain is that at this stage, because we are still moving at a lab scale, we have a lot of uncertainty, specifically related to the data. But in general, we have perceived that the stakeholders, different stakeholders, representative along the supply chain, they believe this is important. So they believe they support the process, and they don't perceive that it's going to be any concern or any issue related to the use of GMOs. And we believe that the LCA can be simplified, and instead of having a full LCA, having the whole range of environmental impacts, we can have a list of indicators and criteria based on policy and environmental priorities, but it is really depending on the location. So depending on the location, we can have a threshold for the water stress or the water scarcity to see how the different elements, how they can be incorporated into the process. And as a general output, we believe that it's not going to be any major social, ethical, and legal issue associated to this. So from an anticipatory point of view, we believe we are more or less ready for the future. And thank you so much for your attention. I'm really happy to have questions and answers from you.
Right. Thank you so much, Eva, for your interesting explanation on your project. Yeah, do we have any question from the students? You can turn on your camera and your mic, or you can post your questions in the chat section. Eva, just wondering, when you mentioned about forest, how does forest there, directly related to this whole process, butyl ester process? I was a bit lost over there.
Yeah, sorry. I think I gave you a lot of information, so it's a little bit difficult maybe to digest, but it was very difficult to summarize 3 years in 40 minutes. But basically, forestry, they use spruce, which is a type of a tree. Spruce is the Christmas tree. Okay, so now it's here. Spruce is a type of tree, and they cut it down and they chip it, and they produce something similar to glucose with this valley process. So basically, they use these forestry resources to produce our raw material. So the raw material that is so we use bacteria and this valley to produce the butyl esters. So this is how the supply chain looks. So from the spruce, which is a type of tree, they cut it down, they make some processes. We obtain on one side the valley, which is used in our process, but also from the spruce they produce ethanol and the lignosulfonate. So they have 3 products going out of the valley process.
All right. Now it got clearer. All right. Any questions?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Right. And also maybe you were mentioning about the GMOs. What sort of organism are we talking about there?
So this is type of bacteria, Clostridium. I cannot say the name. It's very difficult for me.
Okay.
But it's quite common. It's very used in the for many different applications.
I see.
And they basically, I'm sorry because I didn't know your background at all. If they have some LCA background, or if so, maybe I can focus. I can explain in more details some parts of the project. But synthetic biology, in case you don't know what it is basically they focus into one bacteria, for example, these Clostridium bacteria, but also E. coli, which is quite common. And they force them to produce one type of, or one chemical. So basically they modify these bacteria to produce the target chemical that we would like to produce. It in the policy environment and also in the bioeconomy is quite controversy, because it implies there are some people saying that it's like playing to be God, because you modify these bacteria to produce something that you needed, and this is not happening naturally. So you force them, and then once you have modified them, because bacteria are produced very quickly, what happens if they are released in the environment and they interact with other bacteria and other microorganisms?
In the ecosystem.
So it's in the ecosystem. Yeah, it's very tricky, and that's why we were very concerned about how stakeholders are going to perceive this. And we were surprised no one cares, actually, because they don't need to eat this. So if we don't need to eat this, we are okay. If we need to eat it, then let's talk.
Of course. All right. I'm the one asking questions here. Any more questions?
Don't be shy. I mean, there is no silly question. Maybe it was too much information for you. Anything, I don't know. It was very interesting process. It's not about the quantifications. I think the quantification is important to illustrate everything, but I think that was very important is to sit with people. I don't know if you have conducted an LCA before. I know Farah has done it before, but sometimes it's very, you are on with your computer, you ask for data, and then you conduct some results, and then you present them, and that's it. But if you're doing environmental quantifications, you need to understand what others think it is important to include. It's not just you. It's some other people. Okay, why are you not looking into, I don't know, the use of whatever, biodiversity, because I mean, it's important to include others' views and opinions, because what you're trying to do is not for you or the partners, it's for everyone. And if you don't include what NGOs are thinking about the use of forestry resources, then your results are not credible or legitimate. So that's why, and that's what I wanted to present it to you today, that I don't know exactly the type of studies that you are conducting. I'm assuming that you are using some environmental quantifications, but including stakeholders or different views is very, very helpful to understand what you're doing and to have more representative results. That's the main conclusion for today.
Yeah, that's the main conclusion, because they are exposed to LCA, but just on articles. You just read through and summarize the whole thing. So I hope today with your explanation, it sort of fit with their understanding of what more can we do. Like engaging with these stakeholders, you will get more the insights of what they're dealing with, instead of just doing your own thing, things like that. I hope the students will get that notion today, right? Because we have seen the Sankey diagram that Eva shown us today, so it's not something not familiar with them.
Yeah, and I don't think it's only applied to LCA. I mean, if you're doing something like industrial ecology or circular economy, and then using waste, for example, to incorporate into a new process, it is important to understand how the different stakeholders of this supply chain are going to be affected. Yeah, if they are going to be affected. Who else is using this waste? Or I don't know. It's not as simple as quantifying things.
Yeah. And do you have to coordinate the whole team? Are you the one coordinating the team? or are you the you're engaging with the researchers, the NGOs? So I assume Imperial College London is taking the lead in coordinating the whole thing.
Yeah, so I'm taking the lead for that for my team.
Right.
Yeah, so Imperial College is very big.
Right. Nice. Hubaib, do you have any question? I think they
No?
they
Okay.
get the idea of your presentation. It's just that they are quite shy to ask. Eva, what else? Maybe you can share your other challenges that you face, throughout your consultation and research work.
Yeah, so something that is quite challenging for me is to navigate the space between environmental quantifications and policymaking, because it's very difficult to. This is based on my experience. So let's summarize. So in a simple words, policymakers want to have solution black or white.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to give. For example, if you've seen into if you don't understand properly the difference between what I call allocation approaches, you've seen like we have the baseline scenario, and in peak you've seen the different results. So how do you explain this to create a new policy? Or policymaker could ask me, okay, do we need to support this production or not? And it's very difficult to have a yes or no answer. So yes, but there's some things that we need to do, and it depends not only on our production, it depends on the surrounding, it depends on other policies, it depends on where you are. It's not the same to produce this in Norway or in Spain, because forestry might may have some taxes or some incentives. So it's very interesting, but it's also very difficult to have an answer or to guide, and also the technology. So partners that are technologists were asking me, do we need to continue with this project or no? I mean, it's a lot of pressure on my side. Yeah.
Right. So I think the student will get the challenges and concerns regarding, sort of study. And this is a real hands-on experience, from Eva here, sharing her perspective, dealing with stakeholders and doing the quantification themselves. All right, I think no question from the students.
Okay. I hope because everything is super clear, not because they don't understand.
If you don't mind, could you share the slides with me later on?
Yes, sure.
Right, great. And I don't want to take so much of your time. And Eva, really thank you so much for joining us today. We are so happy to have you here. Maybe we can give Eva a big clap on the screen.
Thank you. Yeah, next time I wouldn't mind to go to where you are, which I'm not sure where you are.
Please do. Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia.
Okay, Kuala Lumpur. I wasn't sure where in Malaysia. Yeah. Okay. So